Alright, this will be excuse me, this will be the commentary version of this molecular script compilation. Alright, now molecular script is one of my favorite types of simulations in Blender, mostly because you can have tons of particles, and I've had as many as 5 million particles. Actually, one of the animations in this compilation has 5 million particles. Now, that took forever to bake the simulation. In reality, I think it was something like 3.5 days, or no, it was 5.5 days. And that was with my Ryzen 900X, and my other CPU, which is 9950X. It would have took only maybe a day and a half less time, because it just doesn't utilize the entire CPU. It's more along the lines of the higher the frequency, the better it simulates, because it's mostly single threaded, although not exactly. And as with all of my, well, probably not all, but the majority of my molecular particle simulations, I love to use force fields. And I use basically groupings. That way I can put like certain force fields in certain groups. That way I can have a force field affect only specific particles that came from a specific emitter. This animation right here, I think it was actually meant to be a recreation of one of my old ones, because I made a simulation very similar to this. No, actually, it's not this one. It's the one that comes after these. But it was a recreation of one that I made in like 2018. One of the issues I commonly run into when it comes to animations like this is the keyframing of the force fields. Because you can imagine you're having a force field, you're actually having multiple force fields, and you're having to keyframe them to come on at certain times. And not just come on, but to ramp on, to come on slowly. And then do the same thing whenever it starts to turn off slowly. And then you're having to deal with the location of the force fields as well, because those are keyframed, because the force fields are commonly often moving around the scenes. And one of the other things I do that makes it take longer to render is most of the time I put some sort of background there, and I used to use mostly HDRIs and just use that as a generic background, but quite honestly it does not look as good as if you actually put a physical wall or something like that as a background. And usually when it comes to like a particle simulation, molecular particle simulation like what you're seeing here, I start off with something simple. And as I create other animations, I get a little bit more complicated. There's more keyframes involved, more variations of the force field, and stuff like that. Because typically, I shoot for around 5,000 to 12,000 frames per video. If I'm simulating it in 30 frames per second, which these look like they were simulated in 30 frames per second because it's moving kind of slow, and then probably actually assembled at 30 frames. But I try to, like I said, around 5,000, 5,500 frames if it's 30 frames per second, and then around 10,000, 12,000 if it's 60 frames per second. Because I'm shooting for at least 2 to 3 minutes per upload. But a lot of the times it's ends up being around 5 to 7 minutes because I start getting a little overboard when it comes to rendering. And it has really helped out this year that I've had my new computer that has the Ryzen 9 9950X in it, because a lot of these simulations happen significantly quicker, and the time it takes to render is actually significantly quicker, even though I'm still using the same GPU. And the reason why it's quicker is because the time it takes to actually build the scene before it sends it to the GPU is quicker, because that's being prepared by the CPU. But one of my criticisms of myself when it comes to these animations, sometimes the animations are too slow. And that's something I need to work on. I need to make the animations more energetic, especially when it comes to molecular particle simulations. And one other thing that I often forget to set when it comes to the settings on molecular particle simulations, I need to add a little bit of particle dampening to it. Because see all these little particles that are flying around, they don't have enough dampening, and they're just kind of spinning wildly. In some ways it looks good that way, but it also makes it harder to control and less predictable. I will typically go with 4 different colors when it comes to molecular particle simulations. But sometimes I kind of want to go with more colors and have more emitters and more force fields, but it gets awfully complicated in my old brain because whenever you're keyframing this stuff, because you can't control it in real time, there's just not a computer fast enough to do it. You have to kind of visualize what it's doing or what you think it will do in your head and set the keyframes according to that, and then bake it and see if it works out correctly. And I've done it long enough to where probably 80% of the time I can get it right the first time. But there are times where I'm not exactly sure how many particles I'm going to need, and I'll run like, for example, if you have a particle that's 1 meter in diameter, and then you want to make the particle, a quarter, or a half meter in diameter, it's going to take 8 times as many particles to be the same volume. So sometimes whenever I'm trying to estimate how many particles it's going to take, I will make the particles large and then run a quick simulation with a small number of particles, and then just do the math to see how many particles I will need for a given size for that volume. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, my throat's a little dry today for some reason. I think this, for 2025, I believe I put out uploaded one video every Sunday and every Thursday the entire year. And then every once in a while, one in between. Although, in 2026, I may actually cut that back down to one video per week, because I plan on doing more tutorials, and I plan on adding sound effects to everything, every animation that I upload. And all of these, like particle simulations and molecular particle simulations, whether it be fluid particle or flip fluids, stuff like that, I didn't add any sound effects to them, not even in these compilations, because quite frankly, I'm still trying to come up with a good sound effects method, especially when it comes to particle sims, because I'm not exactly sure how I should make it sound. Now, when it comes to rigid body simulations, which I made a whole bunch of rigid body simulations in 2025. Now, those are much, much easier to create sound effects for. And although I didn't start adding sound effects to the uploads until about the last month and a half of videos, I end up adding sound effects to all of them in the compilation. Of course, I believe this video is going to come out after that video, so you would have already seen that. And see this little flicker down here on this step? I had a double mesh, and I didn't know it until after it was rendered. I had two faces of the same mesh, basically at the same exact position, and the renderer doesn't know which one to display. One GPU would choose to display one of the faces, and another GPU would display another face. So that's why that flickering's caused. And a lot of times whenever I create a molecular simulation like what you see here, I would simulate it again, but use fluid particles, because fluid particles act very different in terms of how they interact with each other. So I'm going to have a whole separate fluid particle compilation, a whole separate flip fluid compilation, and of course the rigid body compilation that has already come out. And I believe I'm going to have like a maze solve compilation where I'm using either fluid particles, molecular script particles, and flip fluids to actually solve mazes. Of course, shout out to Moby Motion. I kind of got the idea from him. He creates some really neat looking materials with his fluid solving maze videos. And this is one I kind of like, how the particles change color based on their direction and speed. I can't quite get it the way I want it sometimes, but the color change being dynamic adds a little bit of, unexpected stuff to it, I guess you could say. And I tend to use my camera movements as in one long take instead of, rendering from one angle, moving to another angle. I partially do that because it just takes less time, because I can just get the camera set up and then just render 10,000 frames without having to babysit it. Where if I have several different angles of the same simulation, where part of it's from one angle, part of it's from another angle, I have to, intervene when it's doing its rendering every few hours or so. Because realistically, when it comes to like one like this, because if you look up here, these are the time, or if you look in the top left corner, those are the times how long it's taken to render each frame. Because I started adding all this information to it, and you can actually press pause and see how long it took to render that frame and how much memory it took. And one thing I'm going to start doing in 2026 as well is I'm going to start replacing the label right here where it says Blender Rookie, and I'm going to actually have it list the actual GPU that's being used to render that specific frame, because I have a 3080 Ti which will render most of these frames in 20 seconds or less, and then I have a couple of 2060 Supers which will take easily a minute on some of those frames. And I have a 3060, and it's actually not that much faster than the 2060 Super, but it has 50% more VRAM, which helps. I did have I still do, I have a 3070, but I think it's bricked. I was actually updating the firmware, and once the firmware was updated, it basically would not work. The computer could not detect it anymore, and I'm debating whether it's worth it to send out to have it fixed, because the best price I can find is it would cost approximately $150 if it's fixed, if they can actually fix the firmware, which I believe they could. They would just have to flash the BIOS chip on it directly. But if they can't fix it, it's still going to cost me like $75 plus shipping, and I just don't know if it's worth doing that for basically going on a 5-year-old GPU at this point. Actually, this one right here, I believe I made a tutorial out of it. And I like doing ones like this, because this right ones like this help teach my brain how the settings will actually affect the way the particles interact with each other. Because it's basically comparison. I'm doubling, or I'm increasing the resolution of the number of particles, and eventually I get up to like 1 million particles per cube. I'm pretty sure this one's 60 by 60 by 60. And that one doesn't look much different, but it's 80 by 80 by 80. And I believe that comes out to like 768,000 particles, somewhere around there. And then that one's 100 by 100 by 100. Which obviously comes out to 1 million particles. And here I'm just kind of doing the same thing, but having multiple cubes. Because the first part was mostly for my educational purpose, and this is just for fun. That's 60 by 60 by 60. Another 60 by 60 by 60. I couldn't tell you how many particles that is without doing the math, and I can't talk and do math at the same time. My brain is old. That's 80 by 80 by 80. And I need to get more into the habit of actually putting the number of particles like down here instead of where it says Blender Rookie in the top left. Actually put more information about the actual scene. Because I have found that it's actually quicker to add the information here than it is to add it in post-processing to the actual video. Because I'm kind of gotten to the point where unless it's a big compilation like this, I'm not even using an actual video editor anymore to create the video. I'm doing most of this in Blender as far as creating the actual video itself out of it to be uploaded. And the one reason why I'm doing that is because that's one less step required to create the video, one less encoding pass. Because right now I'm using Blender to create the individual frames, then I'm using Blender to compile the frames into an actual video, and then taking that video clip into Power Director, which is the video editor I use, and then rendering that out and uploading it to YouTube, in which YouTube encodes it one more time. And the fewer times the video is re-encoded, the better quality it looks once it gets onto YouTube. And this set of animations here, they took forever to keyframe all of this. I have one later on, I believe, quite a bit more took quite a bit longer to get it keyframed correctly. Because every time you see a little square or little plane of particles, that's an entirely separate emitter. Because you can't have one emitter emit particles, stop, and then start emitting particles again. So it's got to have a separate particle emitter for each one, which is kind of annoying. And you can see that it gets to the point where there's a lot of emitters. I think one of them, I don't know if it's this one or a different one, I had like nearly 1,000 emitters at one point. And whenever you have all of them set to interact with each other, it kind of makes the simulation process slower. And then on top of all these emitters, I'm throwing in force fields as well. And not just force fields that affect all of them, force fields that affect only a specific group of emitters. Yeah, this is the one I think that I ended up with over 1,000 or around 1,000 emitters at one point. Of course, like I said, I start off where it's simple, like what you're seeing right now, and then eventually I just add more and more complexity, more and more emitters to it. I need to get more into like character rigging. It's never really interested me that much, but every once in a while I have wanted to add like a character, an animated character to something like this, and I just don't know enough about animating characters to do it easily. It's kind of outside my wheelhouse, but that's something I really need to concentrate on learning sometime over the next year in 2026. And I have tried rendering like the molecular particle simulations in Eevee, and it works, sort of. As long as you have like 200,000 particles or less, something around that, it will actually do halfway decent. And for the most part, it will render as fast or a little bit faster than Cycles. But if you have more than like around 200,000 particles, it's quicker, at least with my hardware, to just render in Cycles. I don't really understand why that's the case, but I'm assuming it's just the way Eevee works. But for the most part, the vast majority of my simulations or animations are rendered with Cycles, because I'm way better at somewhat making it look okay in Cycles. And I've watched several tutorials to try to get better at Eevee, and I'm kind of okay at it, but it's just not as natural for me. I have to kind of guess at what I need to change in order to make it look the way I want it to look. But when it comes to Cycles, I can pretty much guess correctly every time. You know, one thing I want to try to figure out how to do, I used to be able to do it, and somehow I've forgotten how to do it, where you can actually create like an image texture on the particles. I can project an image texture onto the particles just fine, but I can't get it to retain the colors of the image texture as it was spawned. It will change if the image texture changes, but I need to figure that out again. I don't know if they changed something in the way it works, or if I just simply forgot because I'm old. Probably I forgot. Because I have a whole lot of, well, let me rephrase it. I have several tutorials on my channel that I will have to go back and watch myself just to remember how I did something. And a few years ago, I started creating like a 3D object version of like Starship, and I kept meaning to go back to that and create the booster, create Mechazilla and all of that. I just haven't had the time. I have basically the Starship done, and that's about it. And this old cardboard box that you see right here, I made that like, I think it was 6 years ago. It says Blender Rookie Moving Company since I can't see what that says. I can't remember what I had on it. But whenever I create an object, I need to get more in the habit of saving that object by itself in a blend file that I can go extract from later. Because a lot of times I forget to do that. There has to be a good 2 or 3 dozen objects that I created at one point and then lost them because I didn't create a specific file just for that object. Because keeping my all of my blend files organized and so forth has been one of the things that I have seriously been lacking on. And I want to get more into doing actual VFX work where I create visual effects for an actual video. I used to do that a whole lot more, but it's so time consuming to do the tracking. And I've never been really good at the tracking. And I believe it was Default Cube or probably CG Matters, the same person, I believe. They put out a photogrammetry based camera tracking add-on, and from what I can tell, it actually works pretty good, but it's like $30. So eventually I'm probably going to get that just to save me some time when it comes to camera tracking. And of course with this one right here, I actually have an empty, and parented to that empty are 5 different force fields. And that empty is just basically spinning from the center of the room, and the force fields being attached to it are just moving along with it. Keyframing the rotation of the empty, keyframing the turning on and the turning off of the force fields. Sometimes I take notes when trying to get it going because my old brain has trouble keeping it all straight in my head. One of the reasons I got into Blender, it was nearly 10 years ago now, and I had no experience with any kind of 3D software. I mean, I was a truck driver most of my life. I mean, didn't know anything about this stuff. But back around 2013, 2014, I started getting into political commentary on YouTube. And I had a couple of channels that I was talking politics on. And at one point I needed to create a logo, and I needed to have that logo spin. So I started looking for software where I could create something like that, and that's where I found Blender. And not too long after I found Blender, I kind of got hooked on it, and I stopped politics. Quite honestly, it's way more peaceful that I'm just doing Blender and not talking politics. There's so much vitriol when it comes to politics. And besides, I think this right here is more exercise for my old brain. And I know good and well, like, dementia and Alzheimer's kind of runs in my family. So I think keeping my brain exercised will probably help. Plus, I gave up sugar almost entirely. I don't drink soda anymore at all. It's probably been over a year since I've had a soft drink. I'm just trying to get myself a little healthier. I actually started lifting weights recently as well. When I was a kid, I say kid, but teenager, I used to lift weights all the time. And then whenever I became an adult, I was originally working in warehouses, and I stayed fairly in shape working in warehouses. But the moment I become a truck driver, the opportunity to get exercise wasn't there often enough. And plus, being on the road gives you ample opportunity to make poor choices when it comes to what you eat. So I end up getting quite a bit girthy while doing that. And whenever I quit driving a truck, I weighed 440 pounds. Now I'm down to about 300 pounds. I actually feel way better now than I did back then. This kind of animation right here, I kind of call it silly string because all the particles are kind of connected together as they come out of the emitter. I think I did a tutorial on silly string several years back. I should probably do a more modern version because Blender has changed significantly, and so has the molecular script or molecular plus add-on. The molecular script add-on doesn't even actually exist anymore. They call it molecular plus. It's basically the same, it's just a little bit different. Hopefully I'm not talking too quietly and people can actually hear me. I may run this audio through a compressor. That way I can make sure it's at the right levels. And also tell me if you actually like these videos with commentary, because I'm uploading this with just background music and I'm also uploading it with the commentary. Of course, a lot of people tell me I'm kind of a slow talker, and I guess I probably actually am. I'm from Kentucky, and we have kind of a relaxed accent and kind of a relaxed speech pattern in general, especially when it comes to speed. Also, let me know if y'all prefer the widescreen like this. Instead of the 16:9, this is 21:9. Because I think every animation I made in 2025 was this extra wide screen version. The only thing I wish YouTube would allow, you know, how you have the in-screen thumbnails. You can't put the in-screen thumbnails on the extra wide. I wish they would provide a way to do that. Me personally, I prefer the extra wide. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is one that ended up with a whole bunch of emitters. It may be this one. This one did have a lot, but I don't know if it's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, this is the one I'm thinking of. I think it's right after this. Maybe not. It could have already went by for all I know when I was talking about stuff that just don't matter. I think believe this one has 2 million particles. I believe it was 500,000 per, well, probably 400,000 per color. But there's interesting interactions that happen whenever you have a bunch of force fields and a bunch of tiny particles like you see here. Man, look at just below the roof. I forgot to put a material on that board that goes around the edge of the roof to keep the particles from leaking out the roof. I either should have hid that or put a material on it. Can't believe I didn't notice that before. I may have noticed it and just noticed it after the fact and just said, nah, I ain't gonna re-render just for that. I tend to do more like fluid particle, fluids, and molecular simulations in the colder months because it takes longer to render and the GPUs are just putting out free or heat into the room. In the summertime, I typically do rigid body simulations more often because they render quicker and there's less heat being put out into the room. Alright, this right here is the one where it ends up at 5 million particles. Because if you look up in the top left, it says how many particles are being used. What I try to do for the most part is create a bunch of identical simulations where the particle size gets smaller and the number of particles increase, but the overall volume of the particles remain the same. Like this one's 19,531 particles. And then the next one, it should be, see, 39,862. And the one after that will be about 80,000. And the first several I could do in a few hours. But whenever it gets, you know, up in the millions of particles, it will take several days at that point between baking the simulation and actually rendering, because the number of particles drastically changes how quickly it can simulate and how quickly it can render. Right here you have about 156,000 particles. And the next one would be about, I think, 312,000, because I kind of was not so precise after this point, because it's 312. The next one will be like 620,000, something like that. But the difference in the way they start interacting with each other, just because the particles are smaller and there's way more of them, it just starts looking very interesting to the eye, or at least it does to me. $625,000 particles, and the next one is going to be like 1.125 million particles. 1,250,000. And at this point, it's still not that bad. I can generally simulate it and render all of it like this in one day. But whenever I get to like 2.5 million, it's a 3-day process between baking and rendering. And then whenever I go to the next one, which is 5 million, like I said, I think I mentioned earlier, it took like 5.5 days just to simulate. Yeah, this right here, 5.5 days just to simulate. You talk 1 million particles for each color. And actually, I had to re-simulate this twice because it crashed at one point. And the reason why it crashed was because of a Windows update. And yeah, I had automatic updates disabled, but you know how Windows is. It ticked me off just a hair whenever that happened. I used to make more simulations like this. In some ways, I like them, but it's almost too predictable. There's not much dynamics to it. I wonder if it'd be more interesting if I had like this piston right here that pushes it not be so rhythmic. Have it actually change speeds. Same with the beater bars up here. I've tried doing simulations like this with flip fluids, and it just won't work. Every time the piston tries to push the flip fluids, it doesn't matter how many substeps I have, the fluid will vanish. It will not be pushed. I don't understand what's going on with that. But when you have, like on this one, where you have there's 200,000 particles, it actually looks halfway decent. It's kind of like sand in a way, although it's kind of big for sand, and sand doesn't quite move that way. But if I was to turn the friction up quite a bit, it would probably look more like sand, but then it would probably be very difficult to push it through. I have some other versions of this, but with fluid particles, which looks okay. The biggest advantage to using fluid particles on stuff like this is fluid will flow through easier, but fluid particles takes longer to simulate than molecular particles. And plus, because it is acting like a fluid, you can set a different weight for each of the color particles, and then you will have separation by specific density, which I think is kind of interesting. But that'll be in the particle fluid compilation that will be coming out, I would guess, a week after this comes out. Yeah, this one has the molecular particles are very tiny. And when they're that small, they almost move like a fluid. $320,000 particles. This one probably took quite a bit to simulate, probably around 12 hours, I would guess. Usually whenever I have a simulation that I know is going to take longer than 12 hours, I will put it on one of my second PCs. That way, because my main PC, it will pull about 250 watts just idling between running the screens, running the motherboard, which is wildly inefficient in my opinion. This MSI X870, but I can take one of my other PCs that has like a 3600X, which is kind of an old, it's about a 5-year-old CPU, but it's still modern enough to be compatible with everything. And it's only a 6-core, and run that on a B350 motherboard, and I'm using maybe 100 watts at idle. And whenever the screen's not on, even when it's actually simulating something like this, it will consume maybe 80 to 120 watts an hour. So when it comes to these long duration simulations, I will use one of my other PCs to simulate it. Not that it adds up that much, but it'd be a few dollars a month difference is all in terms of electricity, but the amount of heat that it generates is significantly less than using my main PC. And I kind of like the simulations like this where it's the blob of particles, and then I'm shooting it with a kind of like a laser type thingamajigger, and it's just a whole bunch of particles that's hitting it, and it's coming from a single emitter, and there's only a little bit of jitter to the particle alignment. I should have made the scene just a little bit darker here. That way the glowing projectiles would have been more vibrant, I guess you could say. This kind of reminds me of Ghostbusters. Don't cross the streams. Yes, that's kind of a boomer joke. I'm not quite a boomer, but almost. And I tend to use these softer colors, mostly because I think it just looks better than using like if you look at the particles, the lasers, they're more along the lines of the primary colors, whereas the blobs are kind of like a softer pastel version. I kind of like that a little bit better. No matter how many times it gets zapped with that laser, it keeps coming back. Sometimes my videos, quite honestly, just to myself, they seem a little repetitive. Which is one reason why it starts off kind of simple and then gets more complicated. Because as I try to get it more complicated, I try to make it diverge from the typical. But I've often wondered, should I put the more complicated part at the beginning of the video or at the end of the video? Typically, I put the more complicated part at the end of the video. But I wonder if that's causing people to only watch a part of the video and then not watch the rest. Or if I was to put the more complicated version or part at the beginning, I wonder if it would create more video or viewer retention. I'm not sure. I can tell you one thing, the amount of revenue that I make from this has drastically decreased over the past 3 years or so, about 4 years actually. Is around 2019, 2020. 2019 I was probably averaging somewhere around $300 a month from YouTube. And then 2020 I did good. 2020 I was, especially around the election and Christmas time, I was making $1,000 a month. And now I'd be lucky if I'm making 60. And I'm not really complaining. It's just because, I don't depend on this for anything. It's just sometimes I put in a whole lot of time into this and I don't get much back out of it. But it's never really been about the money. The money has just been like a bonus. Well, this compilation is about to come to an end. I got about another minute or so, and that will be the end of it. If you've made it this far, thank you. Most people probably didn't know, but that's fine. That's fine. I still have several more compilation videos to come, and they should be out probably sometime in January 2026. I guess that's it. Everybody, thanks for watching, and have a good 2026, and hopefully a lot of the craziness that we've been seeing will come to an end. Later, people.